Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 4, and this lesson, we're going to cover static classes. Now, this is something you've already seen with our very first class, but we're going to start using more of them and see what the differences are and how we can use them effectively in our application. So let's open up Visual Studio and go File, New Project. And we're going to select a console application. We'll call this Console UI. We'll call this Static Classes Demo. At the end, we add our console.readline. And we're all set. So this right here is a class file, the program.cs. And inside here we have a static void main. And I talked about earlier the fact that we're going to just take this for granted that we use static right now. And we're going to see more of using static today, but in the next lesson, we'll talk about taking this static off. But for now, we're going to talk about static. So a static means that you get one copy for your entire application. That means if we store data, then it gets stored across the entire application for the life cycle of the application. Now, let's see, so far we've just put way is fine because they both go to the same spot. Notice that it has class highlighted at the top. That's the kind of default. So class, and down here in the name, we have to give it some type of name that describes what this class does. And that's an important thing right there. If the name of your class does not describe what it does, you need to rethink your name or rethink what your class does. And the reason why is because it seems like maybe your class is doing too much or it's just vague. Either way, it's hard to read your application code if your names aren't descriptive. So let's create our class and call it user messages. Now, what do you think the user messages class does? Well, maybe it has stuff to do with user messages. Now, the very first thing we need to do is make this class public. I'm going to show you why. I'm not going to make it public yet. And I'm going to put a method in here. Notice that there's a file now called user messages. And inside that file is one class called user messages. These are actually two separate things, the file name and the class name. Now, again, here's a best practice. Keep them the same. Because it's so frustrating to try and find a class called user messages when you have class 1, class 2, class 3, class 4, class 5. Where's class user messages? It's in one of those. That's frustrating. Now there's tools you can do to track it down fairly easily. You can control F and find it, or you can control T and find it. But that's not the point. If you name them the same, it makes life easy. And by default, that's what happens. So user messages. And in here, let's create a private static void, say good morning. We'll do a console write line. It just says good morning. These are not exactly stellar methods. They're just for demonstration purposes. Okay, so now I come back over here. Can I say, what the message called? It was say good morning. So user messages dot, and there's no say good morning. Now I could also try to just say good morning. And it yells at me. Either way, it's not working the way I intended it to. And if I control dot, it says, do you want to generate a method? Well, no, I don't want to generate a method because it already exists. So why is it not finding that method? And the reason why has to do with private or missing entirely. We need to make these public. Now, there are other modifiers that you can do. Internal is another one. But we're going to deal with public and private for now. As you develop your programming skills, you'll want to work on different access modifiers. That's what this is. A public or private is an access modifier. However, for the basics of programming, you'd only need public and private. Now, again, in Module 6, we'll cover the different access modifiers and when to use each. So now I have public class user messages, public static void say good morning. If I come over here and I say good morning is still yelling at me and saying, nope, can't do that. But if I were to say user messages dot say good morning, that works. So why does that work? Well, because since we're not in the same class, it would get really confusing to have all these different methods just kind of sitting there. And you might have hundreds or thousands of methods. And so what we do is we actually reference it by the class name first. So if it's in the same class, you don't need to do that. You can just say hello. But technically, it is program.sayhello. That's technically what it is. You don't need to say program because you're already in program. But once you get out of program or call from a different class, then you have to actually say the class name first and then the method name. So in this case, user messages dot say good morning. And if we run this, it says hello, good morning. All right. So now we've got a separate file that has methods in it. Now, why would we do this? It seems counterintuitive because when we have the methods right here, we can see what they're doing. And it's really easy to call it. They're shorter and it's just kind of simpler. Well, the downside of this, first of all, you make a mess out of your program class because you might have hundreds or thousands of methods. All of them in one spot makes for a messy system. It also does not allow you to organize things in a way that makes sense. So here, this user messages, it's very obvious, hopefully, what that means. These are messages that go to the user. So I would put all of my user messages methods in there. And I'd have a different one for data access. I'd have a different one for calculations. I'd have a different one for, all these different things. And then they're grouped together by type. And it's easier to scan through and see what all the different things available to you are. So if you're not sure what user messages are available to you, you don't have to go find them in different spots. They're all under user messages. And so you can look at this list right here, which is only one right now. But that makes discovery easier. And why is that important? Well, if a new developer comes on board who has not seen your code and they need to send a message to the users on the console and you've got stuff scattered all over, they might miss that method that does it. And so then they might create a method that does it. And now you have two methods doing the same job. And that's not ideal. Because what if you find a bug? Or what if you change the way you talk to users? Now you have two places to change it. And you might miss one. And so then you have applications that aren't working quite right. And you've got these weird, quirky bugs. That's why we want to organize things so we can easily find them. One of the key design patterns to follow is called dry. Don't repeat yourself. And when we program, when we write code, we want to follow that all the time. If we find ourselves doing the same thing more than once, we should find a way to do it one time and use it in other places. So if I'm continually saying good morning, then maybe I create a method that says it for me. Now that's a really basic example, probably not really helpful. But what if I did 3 or 4 things? Maybe I said, welcome to the application and a few other things. And I could just have it done once. And then I call it whenever we start over. That makes sense. And now I have one place to do it. So let's do a little bit of that work. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these examples and start over with things that make more sense. So let's go over to our user messages and we're going to get rid of this one. Let's just wipe out the beginning and change the name. So we're going to call this one application start message. We're going to call it as welcome to the static class demo app. And then let's write a little bit of code that catches what time of day it is and then say good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. Okay, so let's start off with an int hour of day equals date time dot now. That gets the current date and time. I can say dot, and then let's look at the hour. And the hour should be a 0 to 23 value. All right, and this is going to get us close. There will be a time, like, for example, as soon as it hits 0 or midnight, it's going to say good morning, which technically is true. It's just maybe we'd still say good evening. And that's what you have to figure out for yourself. But for us, we're just going to do it based upon the time of day. And as long as it's after midnight, it's good morning. As long as it's not noon yet. Once it becomes noon, it's good afternoon. And once it hits, let's call it 7 p.m., then it's good evening. So if hour of day is less than 12 or noon, then say good morning. Else if hour of day is less than, we're going to do 17 or 7, so that'd be 19. Then we're going to say good afternoon. And finally, our else will be good evening. Now, as you can see, that's a bit of code, and yet it all fits on the screen, which is nice, but I'm not clogging up this code over here, the program.cs, with this user message. So we don't have one method that's huge, and we don't have multiple methods that kind of scroll off the page, when really all I'm going to do here is say user messages dot application start message. And you know what? Let's even make it a step further and pass in a name. First name. And we'll put the first name right here, like so, and put our $sign in the front of the string. And that makes it a little bit, nicer, because it actually talks to the user, which does mean we have to ask for their name, which is okay. So since we're going to ask for a name, I'm going to do a console.clear at the beginning, which is going to clear out any previous text on the console. So now what we can do is up here, I know it's yelling at us, but let's wait. Let's say console.write, what is your name? Let's say your first name. And then string first name equals console.readLine. Now I can pass first name in to our application start message. Now let's create another method over here. So public static, and let's not say void, let's say double. And we're going to say get a number. Let's say get a double. And we're going to pass in a message. So what it's going to do is going to ask the user to give them a double. And as soon as they do, it's going to return the actual double. Now remember that the console returns back strings. So we have to do a conversion first. So let's start with a console.write, and the message will be whatever you pass in. That way we can ask for different things. Please give me an X value. Please give me a Y value. Please give me a number between 1 and 10, including decimal points. Whatever it is. And then we're going to say string value equals number text, let's call that, equals console.readLine. Now, I can't return that double at this point because it's not a double yet. It's a string. So we've learned how to do this before. What we got to do is we got to convert it over as long as it's valid. All right, so let's do our test conversion. So double.try parse. We're going to pass in number text. And then remember that out, double, and this is we're going to call this output because we're sending out. We're going to say if, actually, let's not do an if, let's do a while statement. Because we're going to keep asking them until you give us the right number. So while is double equals false. So if it's true, we're going to skip over this section entirely. So if it's false, we're going to say have used it both here and here. All right. So with this try parse, we're going to try to convert it from a text to a number, specifically a double. If it works, we'll put the value in output. That's an out variable, meaning the data is going to come out that section. Either way, the Boolean is double is going to get a true or false value to tell us if the value being passed in was truly a double or not. If it is, it's going to be true. If it was not, it'll be false. If it's false, we're going to say, nope, not a valid number. Try again. We're going to print the message out asking for the double. We're going to read that number back into that same variable. We're going to try it again. If it's not, when we come back up here, it's still false. We're going to do it again until finally it's true, and then output will have the valid double. Now, we'll just return output. All right, so a little bit of a complicated code for this setup project, but I really didn't want to show you just dummy code. I want to show you a little bit of real code because as your skills grow, you really need to see more and more real code. So now we have this method, but if you start looking at it, the class name is user messages. An application start message sounds like that's exactly what it is. It's a message that goes to the user. This one talks to the user, but it's not really a message. It's more of an action, getting information. So I think we actually have a method here that doesn't really fit in our class. And this is something to pay attention to when you're building your classes. If it doesn't fit under it, don't just put it there. We shouldn't have classes called junk drawer, where you throw everything in there that just fits. Okay? That's not what our classes should do. You should not have junk drawer classes. Instead, what we should do right now is create a new class. So on console UI, right click, add new class. We're going to call this class request data class. Okay, the first thing we'll do is make it public. And then inside here, we're going to take this static method. We're going to cut it out from where it's at. And we're going to paste it in over here. So it makes more sense here. So now we have two classes. We first ask the user for a name, then we say, okay, go ahead and print out the welcome message. And wait a minute, we asked the user for their name. Maybe we could put that into its own method over here. That sounds about right. So let's do that. Public static string get a string. Pass in the message. And then we'll do the console.write, print out the message, and then string outputs equals console.readline, and then return output. All right. So that does the same job as we have over here. So now we can do is instead of this code, we can say string first name equals request data dot get a string and pass in this message. We can get rid of those two lines. Now we have the first name, we have them welcomed. Now let's ask for a couple of pieces of information. Let's say an X and a Y value. We're going to do some addition here. So double X equals request data dot get a double. The message is, please enter your first number. And that goes right into X. Notice I don't have to worry about making sure I get the string off and converting the string and making sure the string converts properly. Done. It's already done for us. Now, what do you think I need to do for getting the Y value? Request data dot get a double. Please enter your second number. That's it. Now I can do some addition and then return back the value of those two numbers. But why would I do math here? It seems more like I should right click on my console UI, say add class calculation library or calculate data. There we go. That's it. Now I'm doing 2-word names here. If you had said calculator, you might step on the toes of something else that's also called calculator. Whereas calculate data is a little bit less likely to cause a problem with name conflicts. So public class calculate data. And now I can say operation. For example, a common one would be to log that this occurred. Well, if I'm doing it over here, now I have to also create a log that takes the same value. So I have to put it in a variable and then put it in both places and log it out. Now I've got a lot of stuff going on in static void main. Whereas over here, I can just add the log statement that says log the value of output. And maybe I have the value of X, Y, and output. But it becomes very easy here because it's doing one thing. Now, if you've heard of SOLID before, it's an acronym for 5 principles that are kind of like best practices for designing and building code. And some of them get very advanced with how they interact with code. But the very first one is called the single responsibility principle. And what it states is that every class should have one responsibility. Every method should have one responsibility. Meaning, you shouldn't do 3, 4, 5 different things in one method or in one class. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't have 3 or 4 or 5 different methods in a class, and each method does something different, but one logical thing. So, for example, user messages. If I'm just giving a message to the user, that goes in the user messages class. I could have 5 different user messages or 5 different types of user messages. That's still one thing. But when I was asking for data, that didn't feel like the same thing. It felt like 2 different things. And so instead of just saying, well, they kind of fit under the bigger umbrella. Nope, I'm going to put it under a different umbrella that's just request data. Now it's very specific. That's what these methods do. They request data. So here, I'm going to have a method that does one thing. It adds. Now, static void main, it wouldn't do one thing if it's doing addition down here plus doing all this other stuff. Right now, it has one job. It's to kind of what I call a quarterback method. If you're familiar with American football, the idea of one method that kind of says, okay, you do this and you do this and you move here and you move there. That's what this method's doing. So it's not doing any work itself. It's telling everybody else to do the work. Maybe it's a boss method. We could call it a boss method. I'm sorry to all you bosses who think that, like I said, don't do any work. But let's now call the add method. So double result equals calculate data dot add x, y, and that result goes here. Now, here's one of the things to know about static classes. If you don't see it pop up here in the list, your method, that probably means one of two things. Either you didn't make it static or you didn't make it public. One of the two. Okay? So now I have the result. Now I want to print out to the console. Well, again, I could put console write line, but now I've got my main method doing two things. One, telling everyone else what to do, and then two, actually doing the printing to the console. Which you could argue, well, you're actually telling write line to print to the console, but usually there's more to it than just, again, writing one line. So let's create another user message that is print results. Public static void print result message. And we'll pass in the message. And we'll print out the message right away. And then we're going to print a blank line. And then we're going to print out the thank you for using our app to calculate for you. All right. So we're going to print 3 lines right here. So now we can come back over here and say user messages dot print a result message. We'll do our $ double quotes and say the sum of X and Y is result. Now our very simple application is done. If we run this, in any of these classes, I'm saying public class calculate data. And that's fine. And I'm using static for all of my methods. But if you want a fully static class, we haven't learned about instantiation yet. We're going to. But for now, if you want your class to be fully static, you can say static in your class. And what that will do is it will not allow you to create non-static methods. So for example, if I said public and I forgot static and said void subtract, it goes, no, you can't do that because it's not a static method. So that can be helpful. So just know that you can add static to your class and make sure then that every method is static as well. You can never then instantiate this class. And that's okay if you intend for the entire class to be static. Now, the other thing to note is that if you store data in these classes, so for example, if I were to put data in, let's say the calculate class, I could put data here. I could say public static double let's actually make it an int instead. So public static int my age. Okay. Now, if I use this in my main, and then let's just right here, we're going to say calculate data dot my age equals 40. Okay. Now I'm going to use a breakpoint, and we're going to wait until we call this add method. So I hit run. I'm going to say my name is Tim. First number is 5. Second number is 4.3. I hit the breakpoint. If I mouse over age or look down here, my age is 40. Okay? So you can see that right here. My age is 40. Well, what's the big deal here? What I'm trying to point out is that number stays in that for the entire life of your application. This is why we don't typically store data in a static class. First of all, it lives for the entire life of your application. That means that it will use storage space, memory space, for the entire life of your application. The more data you have like this, the larger your application's memory footprint is going to be. Also, it's easy to then step on toes. So what if I were to store the value of get a double in a variable on the request data? So up here I could have, requested value. Well, when I do double X, it puts X's value in there. When I do double Y, it's going to overwrite X's value with Y's value. That's stepping on toes. I don't want that usually. So typically, we don't store data inside static classes. The only exception usually is when we want certain little bits of data to live with us for the length of the application. Maybe a connection string to our database, or maybe certain key pieces of information like who's logged in. That might live throughout our entire application. But for the most part, we don't store data there. So my encouragement to you is to assume you're not going to store data in a static class. Prove that it's the best choice to do it. Okay, so default to you don't do it. But then if you have a lockdown, this is a perfect example why we should then consider it. But kind of force yourself to prove that first. Okay, so don't store data by default in static classes. Also, make sure again that you mark them as static if you want the entire class to be static. Okay, now we're going to learn more about class files and about instantiation in the next course. But before we get there, let's look at our tip for today. And that is to use class files to separate your code so that each class and each method has its own purpose. Again, that comes back to the single responsibility principle. Each thing has its own responsibility, just one. All right? So use your class file to separate your code so that each class and each method has its own purpose. That makes your application easier to read. It makes it easier to work with. It makes it easier for people to come alongside and add to. The other thing it does is it also helps you follow dry, that don't repeat yourself. Because if you're separating things out, you'll already have that code you need for the next time. All right. Now, the one argument I hear sometimes from people is, well, that means I have a lot of different files. And the answer is, yes, you do. And that's okay. When you get in the real world, you're going to have thousands of files, whether you do it or not. And by doing it, you make your life easier when it comes to reading your code. It makes things smaller and simpler. If you open up a file that has 2,000 lines of code in it, it's hard to understand what's going on. If you have 20 files, each named well, that each have 100 lines of code in them, that's easier to process visually. Okay? So that's my tip to you, is to definitely separate these things out. Trust me, it's worth it. All right, your homework for today is to create a console application with a static class that handles calculations. I already did I did the add method, but you know what? Create 4 for me. Add, subtract, multiply, and divide. Create one static class that has all 4 of those in there, and then use it. Okay? Ask for an X and a Y, and then do the calculation they requested. Now, that may mean that you have more than one static class, and that's probably a good thing. Okay? But at least have that one. All right? That's your homework. Once you're done with that, come on back to the next lesson.